December 23, 1994. A tip reaches a 65-year-old man in South Boston, and he drives out of the city he had run for 20 years. He had killed at least 11 people. He had also been working for the FBI the entire time. This is the real Whitey Bulger, the gangster behind The Departed. Section 1. The Boy from Old Harbor. James Joseph Bulger, Jr. was born on September 3, 1929, in Dorchester, Massachusetts, about 7 weeks before the stock market crashed and the country fell into the Great Depression. His father, James Sr., had lost an arm in an industrial accident years earlier, and a one-armed laborer in Boston in the 1930s did not get steady work. His mother, Jane Veronica McCarthy, came from Charlestown and was known to everyone as Jean. There were 6 children in the house, and the family moved several times through cheap rooms in Dorchester and Everett before landing in the place that would define all of them. In 1938, the Bulgers moved into the Old Harbor housing project in South Boston. It was the first public housing development ever built in New England. Just over 1,000 brick apartments arranged around courtyards, with rent set against what a family earned. For people who had spent the Depression in cold water flats, moving into Old Harbor was a step up. It had heat, it had hot water, it had grass. The families who filled it were almost entirely Irish Catholic, almost entirely working class, and almost entirely convinced that the few square miles around them were the only part of Boston that mattered. South Boston sits on a peninsula that pushes out into the harbor, cut off from the rest of the city by water on 3 sides and by rail yards and industry on the 4th. People there did not say they were from Boston, they said they were from Southie. Men worked the docks, the shipyards, the candy factories, and the city payroll. Children were placed by parish rather than by neighborhood. Families stayed for generations in the same streets, and everybody knew everybody's business, which produced the one rule that governed the place above every other rule. You did not talk to the police. Not about a fight, not about a theft, not about anything. A man who talked lost his standing, and sometimes lost more than that. That rule was already old when James Bulger Jr. arrived, and he would spend the rest of his life trading on it while breaking it in secret. He got the nickname from his hair, which was so blonde as a small boy that it looked white. He hated it. His family called him Jimmy, and he introduced himself as Jim or Jimmy for the rest of his life. But the newspapers found Whitey and never let go of it. His younger brother William, born in 1934, went a completely different direction with the same start. Billy Bulger stayed in school, went to Boston College, served in the Army, came back and took a law degree, and got himself elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives in 1960. He moved to the state Senate in 1970, and in 1978 he became president of that Senate, a job he held for 17 years. For most of the 1980s, he was among the most powerful politicians in Massachusetts, a man who controlled what bills reached the floor and what money reached which district. Another brother, John, worked as a court clerk. 3 sisters lived ordinary lives. The Bulger family produced a Senate president, a court official, and one of the most violent criminals in the history of New England, all out of the same apartment. Jimmy was in trouble almost immediately. He was arrested at 14 for larceny. He ran with a street crew that called itself the Shamrocks, stole from delivery trucks, took beatings and gave them, and spent time in juvenile detention. He was small and wiry and had a reputation for fighting people much bigger than he was, and not stopping when a normal person would stop. Neighbors described a boy who was polite to older women on the street and frightening to everyone his own age. That combination followed him for 60 years. In 1948, he joined the Air Force. He served until 1952, spent some of it in Montana and some of it in Idaho, was arrested for assault while on leave, went absent without leave more than once, and still finished with an honorable discharge. He came home to Southie at 22, with military training, no trade, and a set of contacts in the neighborhood rackets. What he moved into was armed robbery. He and a small crew hijacked trucks and took the loads, and then they moved up to banks. Between 1955 and 1956, they hit banks in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Indiana, walking in during business hours, with weapons showing, taking whatever the tellers had in the drawers, and driving off in stolen cars. It was not sophisticated work. What made it dangerous for them was that bank robbery was a federal crime with long sentences attached, and the FBI worked those cases in a way local police could not. The crew came apart the way most of them did, which is that somebody talked. A woman connected to the group went to agents, and in 1956, Bulger was picked up in a nightclub in Revere without a fight. On June 21, 1956, he was convicted of bank robbery and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He was 26 years old. Federal prison paperwork from the period also noted a separate legal problem waiting for him in Indiana, connected to one of those jobs, and recorded that he had written to his brother about it in a state officials described as anxious. He arrived at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta in July 1956. What happened to him there is one of the strangest chapters in the whole story, and it is documented well enough that it does not need any embellishment. In 1957, the prison ran a medical study looking for volunteers. Inmates who took part got good time credit toward their sentences and better treatment inside. Bulger volunteered, along with 18 other men. He was told the research was aimed at finding a cure for schizophrenia. For roughly 18 months, he was given LSD and other drugs on a regular schedule, while doctors recorded what happened to him. The study was not what he had been told. It was part of a program run by the Central Intelligence Agency under the code name MK Ultra, an effort to find drugs and methods that could break down a person's mind for interrogation purposes. It ran at universities, hospitals, and prisons across the country from the early 1950s until it was shut down in the 1970s, and a great deal of it was carried out on people who had no idea what they were actually part of. Bulger only learned what had been done to him years later, when the program became public. For the rest of his life, he described insomnia that never went away, bad dreams, and stretches where he believed he was losing his mind entirely. He wrote about it in letters from prison decades afterward, and described it as being taken to the edge of insanity. Whether the drugs changed who he became is not something anyone can prove, and his lawyers tried and failed to make it matter at his trial in 2013. What is certain is that the United States government experimented on him with hallucinogenic drugs under a false explanation, and then, roughly 20 years later, put him on its payroll as an informant. Atlanta did not hold him quietly. He was caught taking part in an escape plan, and the Bureau of Prisons moved him to the place it kept the men it could not manage anywhere else. On November 2, 1959, he arrived at Alcatraz, the island prison in San Francisco Bay, as inmate number 1428. Alcatraz was the end of the federal line, and it was smaller and stranger than its reputation. There were rarely more than 250 men on the island, held in a single cell block on a rock in freezing water. The cells were narrow. The counts came constantly. There was almost nothing to do. The water in the bay was cold enough to kill a strong swimmer, and the wind carried the sound of San Francisco across it, which was widely understood to be the cruelest part of the place, because men could hear a city they were never going to reach. Bulger spent roughly 3 years there. He read constantly, worked out in his cell, kept his record relatively clean, and stayed clear of the worst trouble. Years afterward, he wrote to an Alcatraz historian, describing the time there almost warmly, which sounds absurd until it is set beside Atlanta, where the government had spent 18 months feeding him hallucinogens under a false explanation. The one lasting attachment he made there was to an inmate named Clarence Carnes, a Choctaw man who had arrived on the island as a teenager, the youngest person ever sent there, serving life for a killing in Oklahoma, and extra time for the failed escape attempt of 1946 that turned into a battle with the Marines. Carnes was eventually released, struggled badly on the outside, and died in 1988. Bulger had sent him money for years, and when he died, Bulger paid for his body to be taken back to Oklahoma and buried on tribal land. There is one more detail from that period that only makes sense at the end of this story. Decades later, while he was on the FBI's list of the 10 most wanted fugitives in America, Bulger went back to Alcatraz as a paying tourist and walked through that cell block on a guided tour with everybody else. The prison closed in 1963 because it cost too much to run, and Bulger was transferred to Leavenworth in Kansas and then to Lewisburg in Pennsylvania. He came out in 1965 on parole, after serving 9 years of the 20, which meant reporting to an officer and holding down a job. He came home at 35 and moved back in with his mother in the project. His brother was now a state representative, and the neighborhood had done something for him that he could not have arranged on his own. A man who had gone to Alcatraz and come back carried a reputation that no amount of local violence could buy. In the bars along Broadway, he was the one who had done federal time on the Rock, and had not broken, and had not talked. Whatever he had actually been before he left, that was who he was when he returned. For a short period, he did legitimate work. Through his brother's political connections, he took a job as a custodian at the Suffolk County Courthouse, mopping floors in the building where he would eventually be charged. The parole conditions wanted him employed, and he was employed. It did not last long. Southie in 1965 ran on loan sharking and bookmaking, both of them steady businesses that needed men willing to collect. Bulger had spent 9 years building exactly the kind of name that work required, and there was a family in the neighborhood that was hiring. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The men who put him to work ran South Boston out of a bar on West Broadway, and had done so for years without a serious challenge. Within 6 years, all of that would collapse, and the man they hired as a collector would be the last one standing. It started over a bar fight that most of the neighborhood laughed about at the time. Section 2. The Killeen War. The Killeen brothers ran South Boston. Donald, Kenneth, and Edward Killeen had held the bookmaking and loan sharking business in the neighborhood since the 1950s, working mostly out of the Transit Cafe on West Broadway. Their operation was old-fashioned and profitable. Men placed bets on horses, dogs, numbers, and ball games, and the Killeens took a cut of everything. Men who needed money borrowed it at rates no bank would touch, and the Killeens collected. The Italian organization in the North End left them alone because Southie was small enough not to be worth a fight, and because the Killeens paid what needed to be paid. Bulger came to work for them not long after he got out. He collected debts, he handled problems, and he learned the mechanics of a rackets business from the inside. Donald Killeen liked him. Bulger was reliable, he was not a drunk, and he had the reputation from Alcatraz that made most people pay without an argument. The problem for the Killeens was that South Boston was full of young men who had grown up watching the same three brothers take money out of the neighborhood, and who had come back from Vietnam or from prison with no interest in waiting their turn. They gathered at the lower end of Southie, around a small square named for a local man killed in the First World War, and they became known as the Mullen Gang. Paul McGonigal was one of them. So were Tommy King, Buddy Roach, Pat Nee, and about 20 others. The Mullens were not organized the way the Killeens were. They hijacked trucks, robbed warehouses, and made money in bursts rather than steadily. What they had was numbers and youth and a grievance, and by the late 1960s, they were starting to move on the Killeen betting operation directly, telling bookmakers they no longer had to pay. The two sides ground against each other for years before anything broke. The moment that pushed it into open war has been told so many times in Boston that it has become part of the local furniture. At the Transit Cafe, Kenneth Killeen got into a fight with a Mullen associate named Mickey Dwyer and bit off part of the man's nose. Dwyer walked out bleeding into the street, and the neighborhood found out within the hour. After that, there was no going back. What followed between roughly 1969 and 1972 was a shooting war inside a few square miles of a city, fought between men who had gone to the same schools and drank in the same bars. The ground at stake was tiny. What the two sides were killing each other over was the right to collect from about 100 bookmakers and loan customers on the same handful of streets. The killings ran in both directions. In 1969, a man named Donald McGonigal was shot dead in his car. Donald had no involvement in any of it. His brother Paul was the Mullen, and the shooter, by the account that has circulated in Boston for decades, had the wrong brother. That account was never tested in a courtroom, and the killing was not among the charges a jury considered 40 years later, but Paul McGonigal believed it and acted on that belief for the rest of his life. Buddy Roach was shot and left paralyzed in a bar. His brother Mickey Roach had nothing to do with any of it, and went on to become the police commissioner of the city of Boston. In March 1971, the Mullens killed Billy O'Sullivan, a Killeen gunman and one of Bulger's closest associates, outside his home in Savin Hill. Bulger's own car was shot at more than once. He began sleeping in different places, changing his routine, and carrying a weapon at all times, habits he kept for the rest of his life. The war ended the way these things usually end, with the men at the top dying. On May 13, 1972, Donald Killeen was leaving his house in Framingham. It was his son's 4th birthday, and there had been a party. He was shot dead in his car in front of his own home. With Donald gone, the Killeen operation had nothing holding it together, and the Mullens had effectively won. What happened next is the moment Bulger's whole career turns on, and it did not involve a gun. A sit-down was arranged at a restaurant called Chandler's in the South End. The man who brokered it was Whitey Bulger, who ran a crew out of a garage on Marshall Street in Somerville, in a section of the city called Winter Hill. Winter had no direct stake in South Boston, but he had standing with everyone and an interest in the killing stopping, because a war in Southie was bad for business across the whole region. A representative of the Italian organization was there as well. The deal was straightforward. The shooting stopped. The Killeen operation was folded in, and Bulger, who had been on the losing side, walked out of that room as the man who would run South Boston, working under the Winter Hill organization. He had switched sides at exactly the right moment, and he had done it by talking rather than shooting. The Winter Hill gang that he joined was not an Irish version of the mafia, with a strict structure and a boss. It was a partnership of experienced criminals who split proceeds. Howie Winter was at the head of it. John Martirano was there, a large, calm man who, by his own later admission, killed 20 people over the course of his career. Joe McDonald and Jimmy Sims were part of it. So was Stephen Flemmi. Flemmi matters enormously to everything that comes after, so his background needs setting out. He grew up in Roxbury, served as an army paratrooper in Korea, and came home a decorated combat veteran with a talent for shooting that earned him the nickname the Rifleman. He and his brother worked with a Roxbury crew and got tangled in a gang war that killed most of the people involved. What almost nobody knew was that Flemmi had been an FBI informant since 1965, handled by an agent named H. Paul Rico. In 1969, Flemmi was indicted over a car bombing that badly injured a lawyer. He left Boston before he could be arrested. He stayed away until 1974, when the charges were dropped and he came home. He came home because he was told it was safe to come home, and the person who told him was an FBI agent. That was the environment Bulger walked into. A crew where at least one senior partner was already talking to the federal government, and had been doing it for years without anyone knowing. Through 1974 and 1975, Bulger consolidated South Boston. Some of the Mullins came over and worked with him, including Pat Nee. Others did not, and the ones who did not began to disappear. Paul McGonigal went missing in November 1974. He had never accepted what happened to his brother, and he was never going to work for Bulger. He was not seen again for 26 years, until investigators dug a shallow grave out of a Dorchester beach in 2000. A jury in 2013 found that Bulger took part in that killing. On June 12, 1975, a bar owner named Eddie Connors was shot to death in a phone booth in Dorchester. Connors had been talking too much about a killing he had helped set up. The jury in 2013 found Bulger responsible for that one as well. Tommy King was a Mullen who had come over and worked with Bulger, and by most accounts he was one of the few men in South Boston who was not afraid of him. The two of them fought in a bar room, and King got the better of it. In November 1975, King was told he was going out on a job to kill someone else. He was shot in the back of the head in the car. His remains were found in 2000 near the edge of the Neponset River in Quincy, still wearing a bulletproof vest that had been given to him for a job that was never going to happen. Days after King vanished, a man named Francis Leonard, known as Buddy, was found shot dead in King's car, which was a way of suggesting to anyone paying attention that King had killed him and gone into hiding. In 2013, a jury decided the government had not proved Bulger's role in the Leonard killing, and Leonard's daughter walked out of the courtroom, saying the family had known for 38 years who was responsible, and still had nothing. By the end of 1975, the Mullins were finished as a rival, the Killeens were gone, and South Boston belonged to one man. He was 46 years old. He had a headquarters, a crew, a partner in Stephen Flemmi, and a place in the most capable criminal organization in New England. The business those two sides spent 4 years killing each other over is worth explaining once, because every dollar Bulger made for the next 25 years came out of the same two activities. A bookmaker takes bets and holds the money. He does not need to predict winners. He needs to balance the money on both sides and collect a fee on the losing side, usually around 10%, so that the arithmetic pays him whichever way the game goes. A book with a few hundred steady customers is a reliable income. What it needs is protection, because it is a cash business run by a man who cannot call the police, and it needs somebody to collect from customers who lose more than they can pay. That is the service a crew sells, and it is why bookmakers pay. Loan sharking sits right beside it. A man who loses at the book borrows from the same organization at interest set by the week, so the debt grows faster than he can ever pay it down, and the collection method is not a court. Neither business produces paperwork. Neither produces a complaining victim. That is why both of them survived every crackdown of the 20th century, and why control of a neighborhood was worth killing over. South Boston in that period had reasons to produce a generation of young men looking for that work. The port was changing. Containers were replacing the gangs of longshoremen who had unloaded ships by hand for a century, and thousands of jobs on those docks disappeared. Men came home from Vietnam into a neighborhood with fewer ways to earn than the one they had left. The Mullins were that generation, and the Colleens were the one before it, and the fight between them was as much about age and money as it was about territory. Howie Winter, who ended the war, had watched a version of it before. Through the 1960s, the Somerville and Charlestown crews had fought a gang war that killed dozens of men across Greater Boston and left almost nobody standing. Winter had come out of that period with a reputation as someone who could settle a dispute, and he had a practical reason for wanting Southie quiet. Because bookmakers who are being shot at do not pay anyone. The terms that came out of Chandler's are worth knowing, because they explain how the next 20 years looked. The Mullins were not wiped out, and they were not humiliated. They were absorbed. Men who had been shooting at Bulger a month earlier were now working alongside him and taking a cut of the same books. Pat Nee, who had been one of the most active of them, ended up doing business with Bulger for a decade, and he later served a long stretch for an attempted armored car robbery and wrote his own account of those years. That is the arrangement Bulger preferred for the rest of his career. He rarely fought anybody he could absorb, and he rarely absorbed anybody he could not control. The men who could not be brought inside on those terms were the ones who disappeared. Stephen Flemmi had come out of the same decade from the Roxbury side of it. He had worked with a family of brothers who ran that area, and all of those brothers were dead by 1969 in circumstances that were never fully resolved. He was one of the few men to survive that entire period on his feet, and by the time he sat down with Bulger, he had already been talking to the FBI for a decade. He also had something else by then, arranged quietly in the same period, that none of the men working alongside him knew about. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. In the autumn of 1975, an FBI agent from the same housing project drove out to a parking lot on a beach south of the city to meet him. What the two of them agreed to that night ran for the next 15 years. It kept Bulger out of prison while everyone around him went in, and it eventually killed 9 people. Section 3. The Deal. To understand why the FBI wanted him, it helps to know what the FBI in Boston was actually chasing in the middle of the 1970s. For decades, J. Edgar Hoover had insisted that organized crime in the American sense did not really exist. That position collapsed in the 1960s, and the Bureau spent the years afterward trying to make up lost ground against the Italian-American crime families. In 1961, Hoover created something called the Top Echelon Informant Program. The idea was simple, and it was aggressive. Ordinary informants produced street-level information. What the Bureau wanted was people high inside criminal organizations, people who could describe how the money moved and who gave the orders. To get people like that, agents were expected to build long relationships and to protect their sources. In New England, the target was the Patriarca family, run out of Providence, with its Boston operation controlled by Gennaro Angiulo and his brothers from an office at 98 Prince Street in the North End. Bringing down the Angiulos was the single biggest goal the Boston field office had. Everything else, including the Irish crews in Somerville and South Boston, ranked below it. Bulger fit the profile the program was designed for. He was not in the Italian organization, which meant he had no loyalty to it, and he did business alongside it constantly, which meant he knew things. The Bureau had already tried once. In 1971, an agent named Dennis Condon approached him. Condon was an experienced agent who had handled informants for years, and he could not get anywhere. Bulger gave him almost nothing, and the file was closed. The second attempt worked because it was made by someone from the neighborhood. John Connolly was born in Boston on August 1, 1940, and grew up in the Old Harbor Project a few doors from the Bulgers. He was closer in age to Billy Bulger than to Jimmy, and Billy became a friend and later a supporter. Connolly told a story for years about being a small boy outside a store when the older Bulger brother, already a name on the street, bought him an ice cream. Whether the story is exactly true or has been polished over time, it captures the relationship precisely. Connolly grew up looking at Bulger the way boys in that neighborhood looked at the men who did not have to work for anybody. Connolly went to Boston College, taught briefly, and joined the FBI in 1968. He worked in Baltimore and New York, made a well-publicized arrest of a New England fugitive, and got the posting he wanted, which was back home to Boston, in 1973. In the autumn of 1975, he made his approach. The meeting took place in a parked car at Wollaston Beach in Quincy, south of the city, late at night. What was said between them has been described in different versions by different people, and Bulger's version and Connolly's version disagree about almost everything. The parts that are not in dispute are these. Connolly argued that the Italians were the real threat to Bulger's business, and that the FBI was going to take them down with or without him, so he might as well be on the side that was going to win. And afterward, a file was opened on James Bulger as a top-echelon informant with the FBI's Boston division. That file eventually ran to about 700 pages. Bulger denied all of it for the rest of his life. He denied it in letters, he denied it through his lawyers, and he denied it at his trial, and the denial was the only thing he ever fought hard about in a courtroom. His position was that he paid FBI agents for information and never gave them any in return, which made him a corrupter of law enforcement rather than a rat. In the world he came from, that distinction was the whole ballgame. His lawyers argued that Connolly invented much of the material in the file to build his own career and to cover the fact that he was on the take. The government's position, supported by Flemy's sworn testimony and by the documents themselves, was that Bulger informed for 15 years. The mechanics of how informant information was recorded matter, because they explain how a relationship like this could run for 15 years without anyone stopping it. When an agent met a source, he wrote up what he was told in a report that went into a file under a code number. The source's real identity sat in a separate, restricted file that only a small number of people in the office could reach. That secrecy exists for a good reason. An informant whose name circulates is an informant who gets killed. It has a side effect. The agent who writes the report is usually the only person who knows what was actually said in the car. If a source gives good information, the agent writes it down. If a source gives nothing, there is nobody standing behind the agent to check. Connolly wrote the reports on Bulger for 15 years, and the file that resulted is a document produced almost entirely by one man about his own performance. That is the space in which Bulger's denial has always lived. His argument, which some people in South Boston still make, was that he was buying agents rather than serving them, and that anything credited to him in that file was Connolly padding his own record. What sits against that argument is Flemy, who testified under oath that both of them informed for years, and the fact that a great deal of what appears in those reports about the North End turned out to be accurate and useful. Whatever label anybody puts on it, the effect on the ground was not really in question. Information went from Bulger and Flemy to the FBI, and information came back the other way, and men died because of it. What the FBI got out of it was worth having. Bulger and Flemy could describe the structure of the Angiulo operation, who reported to whom, where the money went, and what happened in what building. Flemy had the deeper connections on the Italian side, and Bulger had the wider view of the region. Reports written under Bulger's informant number went up the chain, and were used to justify more resources and more surveillance. What Bulger got was better. He got warnings, he got the names of people who were talking about him, he got told when a wiretap was up, and when an investigation had been opened, and he got a category of protection that is more valuable than any of that, which is institutional investment. Once an agent has spent years building a source, and once that source has produced results that the office has taken credit for, nobody in that office wants to hear that the source is committing murders. The information starts getting filtered before it ever reaches the people who would have to act on it. The rules were clear enough on paper. An informant was not supposed to commit crimes of violence. An agent who learned that a source had committed a serious crime was supposed to report it, and the source was supposed to be closed. Guidelines issued by the Attorney General in the late 1970s spelled out most of it. In the Boston office, those rules were treated as a formality. Connolly and Morris were not the only agents who came into contact with all of this. Other men in that office accepted hospitality, took gifts at Christmas, or sat down to dinner with two men they knew were criminals. One agent had worked undercover in the Boston area and believed Bulger had warned him about a threat to his life, which created exactly the kind of personal debt that makes objective supervision impossible. None of that was hidden from the office. It was simply how the Boston organized crime squad operated. The relationship stopped being a professional arrangement fairly quickly. Connolly took gifts. He and his supervisor, John Morris, had dinners with Bulger and Flemmi at Morris's house, where Flemmi cooked and everybody drank wine. Morris eventually admitted, under a grant of immunity, that he took $7,000 from them, along with a case of wine, with $1,000 sitting in the bottom of it. Flemmi testified that the two of them paid Connolly more than $230,000 over the years. Bulger's own lawyer told a jury in 2013 that his client had paid Connolly on multiple occasions in amounts ranging from $5,000 to $50,000, which was a strange thing to admit, except that admitting bribery was the price of denying he was an informant. Morris is worth pausing on, because he was not a rogue agent working alone. He supervised the organized crime squad in the Boston office. He was the person whose job it was to make sure Connolly followed the rules. Instead, he sat at the same dinner table. There is one more feature of the arrangement that is usually left out of the retellings, and it is the part that made it profitable rather than merely safe. Bulger and Flemmi did not only inform on the Italians, they informed selectively on people who were in their way. A rival crew, an independent operator making money they wanted, a bookmaker refusing to pay. All of these could be handed to the FBI in a report, and the federal government would then do the work of removing them. It cost nothing, it carried no risk, and it left no fingerprints, because the man who went to prison had no way of knowing where the case had started. Used that way, an informant file stops being a leash and becomes a weapon. Every competitor removed by a federal indictment was territory that came back to South Boston. By then, the relationship had stopped being an operation, with a source at one end, and had become four men with a shared interest in nobody finding out. That is the point at which the rules stop functioning, because the rules assume somebody in the room wants them enforced. The first documented death that came directly out of the arrangement arrived within about a year. Richard Castucci ran a nightclub in Revere and booked bets. He also gave information to the FBI. In late 1976, he told his handlers where two Winter Hill men who were wanted on serious charges were hiding out in New York City. That information went into the Bureau's system, and from the Bureau's system, it went to Bulger and Flemmi. On December 29, 1976, Castucci was shot in the head in a Somerville apartment. His body was wrapped up, put in the trunk of a car, and left in Revere. The message inside the criminal world was that Winter Hill had discovered a leak. The reality was that the leak ran the other way, and the men who killed him had been handed his name by the agency he was helping. In 2013, a federal jury found that Bulger took part in the murder of Richard Castucci. Almost nobody outside a small circle knew any of this at the time. Inside the Boston field office, the Bulger relationship was regarded as one of the great successes of the organized crime program, and the man running it was a decorated agent with a reputation for getting results that other people could not get. The office culture around all of this was permissive in a way that is difficult to explain now. Connolly was popular. He dressed sharply, knew every reporter and politician in the city, and produced results nobody else could produce. In a field office where the whole strategy depended on informants, the agent with the best informants is not somebody the supervisors want to look at too closely, and the supervisor in this case had already crossed the same line himself. There was also a straightforward institutional problem. The Bureau needed the Boston program to work. It had spent years being criticized for ignoring organized crime, and a successful case against the Patriarca family was going to answer that criticism. Every step that protected Bulger could be justified internally as protecting the bigger case. Within 3 years, that arrangement would face its first real test, when a federal prosecutor put together a case that had both Bulger and Flemmi in it, and somebody had to decide whether the informants were worth more than the indictment. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. The case was about fixed horse races, and it took down almost everyone Bulger worked with. 2 names were quietly lifted out of it before it was filed. That decision handed him an entire criminal organization, and the prosecutor who made it would spend the rest of his career answering for it. Section 4. The Carve-Out. The scheme that nearly ended him involved horses. A man named Anthony Chula had built a system for fixing races at tracks across the Northeast. He paid jockeys to hold their horses back, worked out which animals would then be left to win, and made sure the money went down at the right windows. It worked at Suffolk Downs, outside Boston, and at tracks in New Hampshire, Vermont, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Fixing a race is not complicated. It is expensive, because several people have to be paid, and large bets have to go down without anyone noticing, and that is where the Winter Hill Gang came in. They put up the money, they supplied the muscle that guaranteed the jockeys kept their end, and they took the profits. Chula was arrested, and he did what most people in his position do. In 1978, he began cooperating with federal investigators, and what he described was a racketeering case with the entire leadership of the Winter Hill organization inside it. In February 1979, the indictment came down. More than 20 people were charged. Howie Winter was in it. John Martirano was in it. Joe McDonald and Jimmy Sims were in it. The case effectively removed the top of the organization in one filing. Bulger and Flemmy were in the draft. They were not in the final version. The decision was made by Jeremiah O'Sullivan, who ran the New England Organized Crime Strike Force, and who was one of the most respected prosecutors in the region. Connolly and Morris went to him and made the argument that the two men were essential to the case the Bureau was building against the Angelos, and that indicting them over horse races would throw away the biggest organized crime prosecution in New England history. O'Sullivan took them out. He was asked about it years later, in 2002, when Congress finally examined what had happened in Boston, and he acknowledged that the decision was his. He described the pressure from the FBI and the value the Bureau placed on the two informants. Members of the committee pointed out that removing the pair from the indictment left them free to run South Boston for another 15 years, and O'Sullivan did not have a satisfying answer, because there is not one. What that decision produced was immediate and enormous. Howie Winter went to prison. Martirano was tipped off and vanished into Florida, where he lived for years under another name. McDonald and Sims went on the run. The Winter Hill Gang lost every senior figure it had except two, and those two were the two the government had quietly protected. Bulger and Flemmy took the whole thing over. They were 49 and 45 years old, they had no one above them, and they had a working relationship with the FBI. The operation they built was different from what Howie Winter had run. Bulger was obsessive about security, in a way that no Boston criminal before him had been. He did not talk business on telephones. He held meetings while walking, usually outdoors, usually with the other person's hands visible. He changed cars and routes. He kept no records that could be seized. He barely drank, did not use drugs, and went to bed early. He read military history and books about surveillance techniques, and applied what he read. His base was in South Boston, first at a variety store, and later at the South Boston Liquor Mart on Old Colony Avenue, a legitimate business he took over and ran for years. His crew was small, and stayed small. Kevin Weeks came in as a bouncer at a bar called Triple O's on West Broadway, and worked his way up to being Bulger's constant companion, driver, and enforcer. Kevin O'Neill handled the bar and business side. In the summer of 1980, the Massachusetts State Police made the first serious attempt to get inside all of this. They had noticed a garage on Lancaster Street, near the Boston Garden, where Bulger and Flemmy were meeting people. Troopers set up an observation post in a building across the street, and watched for weeks. What they saw was significant on its own. Senior figures from the Italian organization came and went, which told the state police that the Irish crew in Southie was operating at a level above what anyone had assumed. The troopers got authorization and planted a listening device in the garage. It produced nothing. The men who had been talking freely for weeks suddenly held their conversations outside, or in whispers, or not at all. The officers who ran that operation concluded then and there that they had been burned by someone inside law enforcement, and they were right. The state police did not forget it, and their distrust of the Boston FBI office hardened into something permanent that would matter a great deal 10 years later. The FBI got its payoff a few months after that, and it is the strongest argument anyone has ever made in defense of the whole arrangement. To bug a room, federal agents have to persuade a judge that they have probable cause and that ordinary methods have already failed, and then they have to physically get inside. The office they wanted was at 98 Prince Street in the North End, where Gennaro Angiulo ran the Boston end of the Patriarca family, on a narrow street where everybody knew everybody, and a strange face at midnight is remembered for a week. Agents needed the alarm system, the internal layout, the hours the place stood empty, and the habits of the men who used it. Information from Bulger and Flemmi went into the application that persuaded a judge to authorize it, and a technical team went in at night in January 1981 with one attempt at it. Once the device was live, it recorded conversations that no undercover officer would ever have survived long enough to hear. Angiulo and his brothers talked about killings that had already happened and killings they were considering. They talked about which officials were being paid. They talked about the business as a business, for months, into a microphone. The indictments came in 1983, and the convictions came in 1986. Gennaro Angiulo went away for 45 years. His brothers went with him, and so did the senior figure who ran the enforcement side, recorded at a second location nearby. It was one of the most productive electronic surveillance operations in the history of American organized crime enforcement, and the Boston arm of the Patriarca family never recovered from it. That was the argument for the whole arrangement, and on paper it worked. The FBI held a press conference, and careers were made. John Connolly was the agent whose sources had made it possible, and inside the Bureau his standing had never been higher. What the press conference did not mention was what the same operation had done for the men who supplied the information. Every dollar the Angiulos had been taking out of Boston was now available. Bookmakers who had paid the North End started paying South Boston. Loan operations, drug distribution, and extortion in a large part of the city reorganized around one crew that was not being investigated by anybody because the one agency capable of investigating it had a stake in its continued operation. What happened to the men who were left in the 1979 indictment is worth a line, because their fates make the carve-out look even starker. Howie Winter, who had ended the South Boston War and handed Bulger the neighborhood, went to prison, came out, was convicted again later, and lived out a long life mostly out of public view before dying in 2020 in his 90s. He never occupied a position of real power again after the race-fixing case. John Martirano spent roughly 16 years in Florida under another name, running a legitimate front and waiting for the case to go away, until the government caught up with him in 1995. Joe McDonald and Jimmy Sims spent years as fugitives. Every senior member of the organization, except two, either went to prison or went on the run, and the two exceptions inherited everything the others had built. That was not a coincidence, and it was not a break in the weather. It was a decision made in an office by people who believed they were making a reasonable trade. There is a version of this story where the government made a hard calculation, traded a smaller criminal for a bigger one, and came out ahead. That version does not survive contact with what the smaller criminal was actually doing during those years. By 1981, Bulger and Flemmi had already killed Paul McGonigal, Eddie Connors, Tommy King, and Richard Castucci. What the FBI knew about those killings, and when, became one of the central questions of the next 20 years of litigation. Connolly's reports from the period describe Bulger as a criminal who avoided violence. Flemmi later testified that the agents knew exactly what the two of them were, and did not care as long as the Italians kept coming in. The protection had one more feature that made it far more dangerous than a simple failure to prosecute, because the FBI was receiving reports from other informants across New England, and because Connolly had access to those reports, Bulger could be told when somebody in his own world had started talking. That capability had already killed Castucci. The other consequence of that period was quieter and more damaging in the long run. The Massachusetts State Police and the Drug Enforcement Administration both came out of the early 1980s convinced that the FBI's Boston office was leaking. They did not have proof, and the accusation was not one anybody could make in public without evidence. But the operational response was simple. They stopped sharing. From then on, when state investigators or DEA agents built something around Bulger, they did not tell the Bureau about it. That decision looked like a petty turf fight at the time, and it was the only reason a case ever got built. The 1994 indictment exists because a group of investigators had spent a decade refusing to talk to the federal agency that was supposed to be on their side. In 1981, it was about to be pointed at a target 2,000 miles from Boston, in a business that had nothing to do with South Boston at all, over money being stolen from a company that ran a sport most Americans had never watched. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. A businessman in Oklahoma finished a round of golf on a Wednesday afternoon in May and got into his car. He had spent months trying to find out where his company's money was going. The man who shot him had flown in from Boston that week, and the schedule he was working from came from a former FBI agent. Section 5. Tulsa World Jai-Alai was a gambling company. Jai-Alai is a fastball game played in a walled court, popular in Spain and in parts of Latin America, and in the United States, it existed mainly as something to bet on. The company ran frontons in Florida and in Hartford, Connecticut, and the amount of money passing through the betting windows every year ran into the tens of millions of dollars. A cash business of that size attracts a certain kind of attention. John Callahan was a Boston accountant who became president of World Jai-Alai in the mid-1970s. He was good with numbers, he liked being around dangerous men, and he socialized with the Winter Hill crew in Boston bars. Connecticut gambling regulators eventually took notice of who he spent his evenings with, and he was pushed out of the company. The head of security at World Jai-Alai in that same period was H. Paul Rico, a retired FBI agent who had spent his career in Boston and who had been Stephen Flemmi's handler when Flemmi first started informing in 1965. Rico had left the bureau in 1975 and gone straight into the private sector. In 1978, the company was bought by Roger Wheeler, a Tulsa businessman who had built the Telex Corporation into a major electronics firm. He was 55, he had a wife and 4 children, and he had no connection to organized crime whatsoever. He bought a gambling company because it made money. Almost immediately, it made less money than it should have. Roughly $1 million a year was going missing. Wheeler was an engineer by training and a businessman by temperament, and money that could not be accounted for was not something he was willing to let go. He started asking questions, and then he ordered a full audit. Callahan and his friends in Boston wanted to buy the company back. Wheeler would not sell. The way the money was coming out of the company is worth a sentence, because it is the reason 4 people died. A Jai-Alai fronton handles enormous amounts of cash across a night of betting. Skimming from an operation like that does not require a break-in or a forged document. It requires people inside who decide how much was taken in and what gets written down. Wheeler's audit was going to compare those 2 numbers, which is the one thing nobody involved could survive. On May 27, 1981, Roger Wheeler finished a round of golf at Southern Hills Country Club in Tulsa and walked to his car. A man walked up to the driver's side and shot him once between the eyes. The shooter was John Martirano, who had flown in from Florida. Joe McDonald was there as backup. The information about where Wheeler would be and when came, according to what investigators later put together, from the company's own head of security. Paul Rico was indicted in Oklahoma in 2003 and charged with murder in the case. He was arrested in Miami and taken to Tulsa. He died in January 2004, in custody, before he could be tried, so a court never ruled on it. What Wheeler's killing did was open a door that Bulger could not close. Tulsa police worked the murder of a prominent local businessman with everything they had. Connecticut authorities were already looking at World Jai-Alai. FBI agents outside Boston started asking questions about the Boston end of it, and a man in Boston who knew something about it decided that this was his opportunity. Brian Halloran was a Winter Hill associate, a heavy drinker with a habit of talking, and in October 1981, he shot a cocaine dealer named George Pappas in a Chinatown restaurant. He was charged with murder, and he was facing the rest of his life in prison. In early 1982, he went to the FBI and offered to trade. He told agents that Callahan had approached him about killing Roger Wheeler, that he had turned it down, and that Bulger and Flemmi were involved. He asked to be put into the witness protection program. That information moved through the Boston office. It went to John Morris. It reached John Connolly, and it reached Bulger. The Bureau decided Halloran was not credible enough to protect. He was a drunk with a murder charge. His story kept changing, and there was no corroboration for it. That was the official reasoning. What is not in dispute is that the man he was informing on found out he was informing. On the evening of May 11, 1982, Halloran was drinking at a restaurant on Northern Avenue on the South Boston waterfront. Kevin Weeks was outside watching the door, and when Halloran came out, Weeks got on a radio. Halloran got into the passenger seat of a car driven by Michael Donahue. Donahue was 32, a truck driver from Dorchester with a wife and 3 young sons. He had no involvement in any of this. He knew Halloran and had offered him a ride home. A car pulled alongside. The man in the passenger seat was wearing a wig and a false mustache, which was a deliberate touch meant to point investigators toward one of Halloran's other enemies. Weeks testified at trial that it was Bulger, and that Bulger opened fire with an automatic weapon, kept firing as the car crashed, drove around, and shot Halloran again as he lay in the road. There was a second gunman in the back seat wearing a mask whom Weeks said he could not identify, an account the Donahue family has never accepted. Halloran was hit more than 20 times. He lived long enough to give a name to responding officers, and the name he gave was somebody else, which suggests the wig worked. Michael Donahue was shot in the head and died at the wheel. That left Callahan, and Callahan was the weak point. He was an accountant, not a gangster. Investigators in Oklahoma and Florida wanted to speak with him, and everyone in Boston understood that if they got him into a room, he would not last an hour. Connolly passed the warning. Flemmy testified that Connolly told them the FBI wanted to interview Callahan, and that Callahan would give up all of them, on Wheeler and on Boston killings besides. John Martirano was Callahan's friend. They had spent years drinking together, and Martirano liked him. He was told it had to be done, and he did it. In late July 1982, he met Callahan at the airport in Fort Lauderdale, shot him in the back of the head, and put his body in the trunk of Callahan's own Cadillac. The car was left in a parking garage at Miami International Airport, and it was found on August 2, 1982. 4 men were dead inside 15 months. One was a businessman in Oklahoma who had asked where his money was going. One was an informant the FBI had declined to protect. One was a truck driver giving a friend a lift. And one was an accountant who was about to be interviewed. What is worth saying about the Tulsa killing is that it stayed unsolved for 18 years. Oklahoma had a dead businessman, a general idea that the answer was in Boston, and nothing that could be put in front of a jury. No physical evidence tied anybody to that parking lot, and nobody who knew what had happened was going to say so while the organization was intact. It broke open only when the men who did it started trading. John Martirano admitted the shooting as part of his cooperation agreement in the late 1990s, almost 2 decades after Roger Wheeler died, and only because the arrangement in Boston had collapsed, and the people inside it were suddenly bidding against each other for a deal. That is the pattern across this entire case. Almost none of it was solved by investigation. It came apart when the protection stopped and the men who had relied on it turned on one another. There is one thing about the Halloran killing that has never sat right with anyone who has looked at it closely. Whatever the Bureau thought of his reliability, he had made a serious allegation about an unsolved murder in another state, and he had direct knowledge of the people he was naming. The correct handling of it was to protect him while the account was checked. Instead, he was turned down for witness protection. What he had said moved through an office where at least 2 people were compromised, and 8 weeks later, he was shot to death on a public street alongside a truck driver who had never done anything to anybody. There were people eating dinner a few yards away. It happened in the open, in the early evening, in a city with a police department, and the man who by every account did the shooting was at that moment carried on federal paperwork as a cooperating source. World Jai Alai itself limped on for years afterward under new ownership and eventually faded along with the sports audience in the United States, which is a strange footnote to 4 killings. The company that 4 people died over is essentially gone. John Callahan left a wife and children in Boston. His widow and his son were still being asked about the case decades later, when John Connolly came up for release from a Florida prison in 2021, and they did not oppose it. Their view, expressed publicly at the time, was that a dying man in a hospice was already serving a sentence. One man never let the Wheeler case go, and his experience says as much about the arrangement as anything that happened in Boston. Mike Huff was a young Tulsa homicide detective when the call came in from the country club in May 1981. It was his case, and he worked it for the rest of his career. Within days, he was aware that the trail ran back to Boston, and he went there and started asking questions. And what he ran into was an agency that did not want the questions asked. Leads went nowhere, and requests went unanswered. He spent years being told, in various polite ways, that there was nothing in Boston for him. He kept the file open anyway. Decades later, when Congress finally started examining what the FBI had done in New England, Huff was one of the people who testified about it, and he described in plain terms what it is like to work a murder when another arm of his own government was standing in the doorway. He was still connected to the case when Paul Rico was indicted in Oklahoma in 2003. The Wheeler family did the same thing from the other side. Roger Wheeler's children spent 20 years pressing for an accounting, first from Oklahoma authorities, and then from Washington. His son appeared before a congressional committee and described what it had cost the family to be told for so long that nothing could be done. There is a specific bitterness in the Wheeler case that separates it from most of the others. Wheeler was not a criminal, was not connected to Boston, and had never met any of these people. He was a businessman in Oklahoma who bought a company and then noticed that $1 million a year was going somewhere it should not go. He did the correct thing, which was to order an audit, and he was shot in the head in his own car for it, using a schedule supplied by a retired agent of the same federal agency that was protecting the men who ordered it. The family spent the next 30 years trying to get an answer out of the United States government about what its agency had done. In 2007, a federal judge found that the FBI was responsible for the deaths of Michael Donahue and Brian Halloran. In May 2009, United States District Judge William Young ordered the government to pay their families nearly $8.5 million, awarding $6.4 million to Donahue's widow and 3 sons, and just over $2 million to Halloran's widow. He described the government's conduct as negligence, self-interested arrogance, inattention, and corruption, and he found that it had caused the 2 men's murders. The government appealed, and it did not appeal on the facts. It appealed on the deadline. In 2011, the First Circuit Court of Appeals threw out the entire award on the grounds that the families had filed their claims after the statute of limitations had run, in September 2000. A request for the full court to reconsider produced a 3-3 split, which was not enough. One of the judges wrote a dissent, saying the moral of the ruling appeared to be that crime pays as long as the government is the one committing it, and pointed out that the same government had spent years assuring these families that somebody else was responsible. Senator John Kerry filed legislation to have the Treasury pay the families anyway. It did not become law. Patricia Donahue, who had been 26 years old with 3 boys when her husband was killed, was still filing petitions about it in 2013. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. In the same period, 4 more people were killed inside one house in South Boston, and none of them were rivals or informants in any real sense. 2 were women. The house had a dirt basement, and everything that happened in it stayed hidden for 15 years. Section 6. The House on East 3rd Street. Deborah Davis was 26 years old. She had met Stephen Flemmi when she was 17 and working behind a counter at a jewelry store, and he had been with her ever since. He was more than twice her age. He bought her cars and clothes and a house in Randolph, and by 1981, she had had enough of it and wanted to leave him for someone closer to her own age. There was a second problem. Flemmi had talked to her about the FBI. By his own later testimony, she knew there was an arrangement, and she knew the name of the agent involved. In September 1981, she went to a house on East 3rd Street in South Boston, and she was never seen again. What happened inside that house is described only by Flemmi, who testified that Bulger strangled her while he watched, and then made him dig the grave. Bulger's account, given through his lawyers, was that Flemmi killed her himself and lied about it to save his own position with the government. There is no third witness. When a jury got the question in 2013, it could not agree, and returned no finding at all on the murder of Deborah Davis. Her brother Steve, who had sat through every day of that trial, walked out of the courtroom afterward and said he had been stuck in the middle for 32 years and still was. Her remains were recovered in 2000 from the edge of the Neponset River in Quincy. The house on East 3rd Street was the address that mattered from then on. It was an ordinary 3-story home on an ordinary residential street of South Boston, a few doors from other families, the kind of block where people put out chairs in the summer. It had a dirt floor basement. In July 1983, a man named Arthur Barrett was invited there. Barrett, known to everyone as Bucky, was a professional safecracker and one of the best in New England. 3 years earlier, he had been part of the crew that went through the vault of the Depositors Trust Bank in Medford over a holiday weekend and took roughly $1.5 million, a job that later turned out to have involved police officers. Barrett had money, and people knew he had money. The Depositors Trust job is part of why he was a target. That crew had gone through a bank vault over a long holiday weekend and emptied hundreds of safe deposit boxes, taking cash, jewelry, and bearer bonds, and much of what came out of it was never recovered or reported. Because a lot of what people keep in a safe deposit box is money they have not told anyone about. Barrett was believed to be sitting on a share of it 3 years later. He was told there was a shipment of diamonds for sale and to come to the house on East 3rd Street. When he walked in, Bulger came out of a side room with a weapon, and Barrett was chained to a chair. The questioning went on for hours, and it was about money. Where it was, who was holding it, what he could get. He gave up around $47,000, and he was made to telephone people and arrange for more to be collected. When there was nothing left to take, he was told to go down to the basement. He was shot in the back of the head on the stairs. Flemmy pulled his teeth out afterward, on the theory that a body without teeth is much harder to identify. Barrett was buried in the dirt. 16 months later, they brought a fisherman to the same house. John McIntyre was 32 and lived in Quincy. He was a boat engineer, and a few weeks earlier, he had crewed a trawler that carried a load of weapons out of Massachusetts, bound for the Irish Republican Army, a shipment that was seized at sea before it ever reached land. There was also a marijuana load that came apart around the same time. In November 1984, McIntyre was arrested after a domestic disturbance, and while he was in custody, he started talking. He talked to local police, and then he talked to Customs and to the Drug Enforcement Administration. He described the guns, and he described the drugs, and he named the people behind both. Word of that got back to South Boston. He was told to come to East 3rd Street for a party. He was chained to a chair in the kitchen and questioned for hours, and by the accounts given later, he answered everything he was asked. Bulger then attempted to strangle him with a rope, which did not work properly. He asked McIntyre if he would rather take one in the head, and McIntyre said he would. He was shot. His teeth were pulled, and he was buried in the basement next to Bucky Barrett. In 2006, a federal judge awarded $3.1 million to John McIntyre's mother and brother, finding that the FBI's handling of its 2 informants had caused his death. The 4th person killed in that house was Deborah Hussey. She was 26 as well, and she was the daughter of Marion Hussey, the woman Flemmy had lived with for decades. Flemmy had helped raise her from the age of about 4. He had also begun a sexual relationship with her when she was a teenager, a fact he admitted under oath. By the beginning of 1985, her life had come apart. She was using drugs, she was in trouble constantly, and she had started using the names of the 2 men around South Boston, which was the thing they could not tolerate. In January 1985, she was brought to East 3rd Street. Kevin Weeks testified that he walked in and saw Bulger on the floor with his legs wrapped around her, choking her from behind, and that when it was over, Flemmy believed she was still alive and used a rope and a stick to finish it. Her teeth were pulled as well. She was buried in the basement with the other 2. The forensic anthropologist who examined what was left of her 17 years later told a jury she could not determine a cause of death from the remains, which she said is common in strangulation cases, and that all she could establish was that the death was caused by violence. It is worth pausing on the fact that all 4 of these killings happened in the same building. Bringing somebody to a house and killing them there is not the behavior of a criminal worried about being caught. It is the behavior of a man who has decided that the ordinary risks do not apply to him. A body in a street produces a crime scene, witnesses, and a case. A body in a basement produces nothing at all, provided nobody ever comes looking, and for 15 years nobody did. 4 people walked through that door, believing they were going to a meeting, a party, or a conversation, and every one of them had known these men for years. Bucky Barrett had worked alongside them. John McIntyre had run guns for them. Deborah Hussey had been raised inside the household of one of them. Deborah Davis had spent 9 years of her life with him. None of them were killed by strangers, and that is the reason so few of these cases ever produced a witness. There is a geographic detail about all of this that people from outside Boston tend not to believe. Stephen Flemmy's parents lived on East 3rd Street. They lived for years, next door to the home of William Bulger, the president of the Massachusetts Senate. That stretch of street held the family of one of the state's most powerful elected officials, the parents of a man who had been an FBI informant since 1965, and, a short walk away, the property where 4 people were murdered. That is not evidence of anything about Billy Bulger, who was never charged with any involvement in his brother's crimes and always denied knowledge of them. It is a description of how small the world was. There were no warehouses on the edge of a city and no compound behind a fence. There was a handful of men killing people in houses on ordinary residential streets, in a neighborhood where everybody knew everybody's mother. In October 1985, the house was sold, which created a problem. 3 bodies, in the basement of a property about to change hands, is not a situation that can be left alone. Weeks, Bulger and Flemmy dug them up at night, moved them across the water into Dorchester, and reburied all 3 in a strip of ground on Hallett Street, across from Florian Hall, which is a function hall used mainly by Boston firefighters for weddings and retirement parties. People parked on that ground for years. That is where the whole thing sat until Kevin Weeks was indicted in 1999, learned that the man he had worked for had been an FBI informant the entire time, and decided to cooperate. On January 13, 2000, investigators began digging on Hallett Street in frozen ground. They worked for hours and brought up the bones of 2 men and a woman. They were identified as Arthur Barrett, John McIntyre, and Deborah Hussey. Over the following months, Weeks led them to the rest. In September 2000, the remains of Paul McGonigal came out of a grave near the shoreline at Tinian Beach in Dorchester, along with his shoes and a gold claddagh ring with bullet fragments in the skull. The recovery had to be done against the tide, with salt water bubbling up through the sand. Later that autumn, at the edge of the Neponset River in Quincy, they found Tommy King, still in the bulletproof vest he had been handed for a job that did not exist, and then Deborah Davis. 6 bodies came out of the ground in Boston in 1 year, all of them from the 1970s and 1980s, all of them people who had been listed as missing and forgotten by everyone except their families. The families found out about most of it on television. Steve Davis had spent 19 years not knowing where his sister was. Marion Hussey learned what had been done to her daughter and who had done it. The McIntyre family had spent 16 years being told by various people that John had probably taken off somewhere. Identifying what came out of those graves was slow, careful work. Bodies buried in wet coastal soil for 15 or 20 years lose almost everything soft. The teeth had been deliberately removed from 3 of the victims, which is exactly why they were removed, because dental records are the fastest route to a name. What remained were bones, fragments of clothing, and personal items. Some of the identifications came down to small objects. A gold claddagh ring with part of a finger bone still inside it, a pair of shoes, a navy suit and a set of driving gloves, a bulletproof vest that told investigators more about how a man had been killed than any bone did. The digging itself became a public event in Boston in 2000. Tents went up over the sites, television trucks parked at the edges, and behind the tape stood families who had spent between 15 and 26 years not knowing, watching people in coveralls carry things away in boxes. The house itself is still there on East 3rd Street. Somebody lives in it. It went back to being a normal home in a normal South Boston neighborhood, and people who know what it is still slow down when they pass it. The 4 killings inside that house are not the ones that made Bulger famous, because none of the victims were prominent, and none of them died in public. They are the ones that describe most precisely what he was. A safecracker with money, a fisherman who had talked, a woman who wanted to leave him alone, and a young woman who had become an embarrassment. All of them lured to the same address, in the middle of a residential neighborhood, in a city with a police department, in a period when the federal government had a file on the man doing it, and was calling him one of its most valuable sources in New England. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. While all of that was happening, the operation itself was earning more than it ever had, from businesses Bulger told his own neighborhood he would never allow. It ran on cash, on fear, and on one piece of paper worth $14 million that gave him something he had never had before, which was a legal explanation for his money. Section 7. The business. For years there was a story told about Bulger in South Boston that a lot of people believed, including people who had no reason to be fond of him. The story was that whatever else he did, he kept drugs out of the neighborhood. He was supposed to have thrown dealers off the street, warned families, protected the kids. It was not true, and the record on that is about as complete as the record on anything in this case. What actually happened is that from the late 1970s onward, the drug trade in South Boston ran with his permission and paid him for it. Marijuana first, then cocaine, then everything else. He did not stand behind a counter and sell it. He taxed it. A dealer who wanted to work in Southie went to see Bulger, or somebody who worked for him, agreed on a number, and paid it every week. A dealer who did not want to pay was beaten, or had his supply taken, or was told to leave. Several of the men who paid testified about it in open court, described the meetings, described the amounts, and described what they were told would happen if the money stopped. In 1990, federal agents ran an operation that ended with more than 50 South Boston drug dealers charged. The investigation established the structure of the local trade in detail, and Bulger sat on top of it. He was not charged, which by that point should not surprise anybody. What that trade did to the neighborhood is not a matter of opinion, because people wrote it down while it was happening. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the housing projects of South Boston recorded a cluster of teenage overdose deaths and suicides, bad enough that public health officials came in to study it. Reporters wrote long pieces about it. Parents in Old Colony and Old Harbor buried children. Community groups formed. The number of young people from a few streets who died in that period was out of proportion to anything comparable in the city, and it was happening in the same square mile, at the same time, as the arrangement where every dealer working those streets paid a weekly amount to the man who was supposedly keeping the place clean. The rest of the business was extortion, and extortion in that operation covered a much wider range of people than the word usually suggests. Bookmakers paid rent, that was the word used. Anyone booking bets in South Boston, or across a large part of the city after the Angelos went to prison, paid a weekly amount for the privilege of not being interfered with. An independent criminal running anything profitable, whether it was a truck hijacking crew or a drug operation or a jewel theft, paid a share. Legitimate businessmen paid too. A man named Michael Solomondo had been in business with John Callahan. After Callahan was killed, Solomondo was summoned to a meeting and told that Callahan had owed money and that the debt was now his. He paid around $400,000. A man named Richard Bucheri, who had done nothing at all except get involved in a property dispute with somebody connected to Flemmy, was brought to a house, had a weapon put against his head, and was told to pay $200,000. He paid it. The case that stayed with people the longest was a liquor store. In 1984, a man named Stephen Rakes and his wife Julie opened a liquor store on Old Colony Avenue. It was new, it was in a good spot, and they had put everything they had into it. Bulger, Flemmy, and Kevin Weeks came to the Rakes' home. They sat in the kitchen. A weapon was placed on the kitchen table where everyone could see it. Rakes had a small daughter in the house, and by the account given at trial, one of the children ended up in Bulger's lap during the conversation. The Rakes family sold the store for $100,000, which was a fraction of what it was worth, and Bulger took it over. The South Boston Liquor Mart became his headquarters and the front for a great deal of what came afterward. He stood outside it. He did business in the parking lot. He collected there. Triple O's sat on West Broadway in the middle of an ordinary shopping street, between shops people used every day. That is the detail that captures how this operation worked. It was not hidden in an industrial park. It was on the main road of the neighborhood, and everybody in South Boston knew what it was, which was the point. A business that everyone knows about does not need to threaten anybody very often. Rakes spent years afterward being pressured about what he would say if anyone ever asked, and when investigators eventually did ask, he denied under oath that he had been extorted. He was prosecuted for that and convicted in 1998. Later, when it was safe, he told the truth about it, and he spent years waiting for the chance to say it in front of Bulger himself. He never got it. In 2013, he was dropped from the prosecution witness list, and days later he was found dead beside a road in Lincoln, Massachusetts. It had nothing to do with Bulger. A business associate named William Camuti had poisoned him with cyanide over money, and was convicted of the murder in 2016 and sentenced to life. The timing was so extraordinary that for about a week the entire city assumed it had to be connected, and it was not. There was also a bar. Triple O's on West Broadway was the place where a lot of this happened, and its reputation in South Boston was such that people crossed the street rather than pass the door on certain nights. Then there was the gun shipment. In September 1984, a fishing trawler called the Valhalla left Gloucester, Massachusetts, carrying roughly 7 tons of weapons and ammunition, rifles, handguns, ammunition by the ton, and heavier equipment. The load was destined for the Irish Republican Army. and the operation had been organized in Boston, with money and coordination from Bulger, Pat Nee, and a Charlestown smuggler named Joe Murray. The Valhalla met an Irish trawler called the Merida Ann off the coast of Ireland and transferred the cargo at sea. The Irish Navy seized the Merida Ann on September 29, 1984, with everything aboard. The tip that made the seizure possible came from inside the IRA itself, from a man who was working for the Irish police. The Boston End never knew that, which is what killed John McIntyre, because the crew assumed the leak had to be one of their own. Murray is worth a line of his own, because he shows how far outside South Boston the operation reached by the middle of the 1980s. He ran one of the largest marijuana importation businesses on the East Coast, bringing loads in by sea, in quantities measured in tons, and Bulger taxed it the way he taxed everything else that moved through the area. Murray was eventually prosecuted, and in 1992 he was shot dead by his own wife during a domestic dispute, which removed another person who could have described how the whole thing worked. Nobody on the American side was ever convicted over the weapons, in part because the man who talked about them was killed before he could testify. The single most useful thing Bulger ever acquired, from a practical standpoint, cost him nothing to arrange and required no violence at all. On July 26, 1991, a winning Mass Millions lottery ticket worth $14.3 million was sold at the South Boston Liquor Mart. It was bought by a man who worked in the area. What happened next was that the prize was claimed by 4 people, and one of them was James Bulger, along with Kevin Weeks and 2 brothers named Linsky. Bulger paid to be added to the ticket. What he bought was not really the money, although the money was real and came to him in annual payments of roughly $90,000 after tax. What he bought was an answer. From that day forward, if anyone from the Internal Revenue Service or any other agency asked how a man with no visible job supported himself, there was a documented, verifiable, entirely legal source of income with the state of Massachusetts behind it. He collected those payments for years. When he ran, the payments were seized. The rest of the money went where money like that always goes, which is into cash and into places that do not report. Investigators later established that he kept safe deposit boxes in several cities, including outside the United States. He built compartments into walls. He kept firearms in the homes of associates and relatives of associates, one of which was later found stuffed with weapons that had nothing to do with the people living in the house. When he was finally arrested in 2011, agents opened up the walls of a small rented apartment and took out more than 30 firearms and over $800,000 in cash, which was what he had chosen to run with, and was almost certainly a fraction of what existed. The scale of all of it is worth stating plainly. Over roughly 2 decades, one man and a crew that never numbered more than a handful of people controlled bookmaking, loan sharking, drug taxation, and extortion across a substantial part of a major American city. He did it without ever being arrested. He did it while under the nominal supervision of the FBI. And he did it while presenting himself to his own neighborhood as a man who looked after the place. Not everybody in South Boston believed the story. Plenty of people knew exactly what he was, and said nothing, for the reasons people in that situation always say nothing. But the story was useful, and it survived long enough that when the truth came out in the late 1990s, a lot of people in the neighborhood took it as a personal insult. The extortion side worked because of a detail that is easy to miss. The people being squeezed had nowhere to go. A liquor store owner being forced to sell at a fraction of value, or a businessman being told a dead man's debt was now his, would ordinarily pick up a telephone and call the FBI. In Boston in the 1980s, calling the FBI about James Bulger meant that name went straight to the desk of an agent who would tell him. Some of the victims understood that instinctively. Others found out. That is the part that separates this from an ordinary organized crime story. Extortion works on the threat of violence. This operation added a second threat on top of it, which was that the institution they would normally turn to was compromised, and there was no way for an ordinary person to know how far the compromise went. The lottery arrangement had a second life afterward that nobody planned. Once Bulger ran in 1994, the state was still cutting an annual check to a wanted fugitive, and those payments had to be stopped and seized through the courts. For a few years, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was, on paper, one of the sources of income for the man on the FBI's most wanted list. By the beginning of the 1990s, the operation was as profitable as it had ever been. What had changed was outside it. The people who had protected him were retiring, and a new set of investigators had arrived in Boston who did not know the rules and had no interest in learning them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. In the winter of 1994, the case against him was finally written and ready to be filed. 2 days before Christmas, somebody made a phone call. He was on the road within hours, and the government spent the next 16 years looking for a man who had been given a head start. Section 8. The tip. The whole thing nearly ended in public 6 years before it did. In September 1988, the Boston Globe published an investigative series reporting that James Bulger had a special relationship with the FBI. The reporters could not prove the word informant to the standard a newspaper needs, so the story said what it could say, which was that the most powerful criminal in South Boston appeared to be protected by the federal government. It was accurate, and it was on the front page of the biggest newspaper in New England. Nothing happened. The Bureau denied it. Bulger did not run. His own crew, including the men who worked beside him every day, did not believe it, because he told them it was garbage, and because the alternative was unthinkable to them. Kevin Weeks worked for him for another 6 years without accepting it. Years later, John Morris admitted under oath that he had been the source for that story, and said he had leaked it hoping the exposure would force the relationship to end. Prosecutors put it more bluntly, suggesting he had hoped the story would get Bulger killed and take the problem away with him. John Connolly retired from the FBI in 1990 after 22 years. He was given a farewell dinner, he was well regarded, and he walked into a job as head of corporate security at Boston Edison, the electric utility. He kept his contacts inside the Bureau, he kept his friendships in South Boston, and he kept talking to Bulger. The reason any of it ever came apart is that a small group of people decided to work the case without telling the FBI anything. Fred Wyshak was an assistant United States attorney who came to Boston in 1989 after prosecuting organized crime cases in New Jersey. He arrived with no local loyalties and no idea that certain names were supposed to be left alone. Brian Kelly worked alongside him. On the investigative side, they had the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Massachusetts State Police, and the Boston Police Department, 3 agencies that had all been burned by leaks over the previous decade and had reached their own conclusions about where the leaks came from. The Massachusetts State Police, in particular, had never let go of what happened at the Lancaster Street garage in 1980. Officers who had watched a listening device go dead overnight had spent 10 years being told they were imagining things. The plan was ordinary police work, and it was the right plan. Nobody was going to walk in and testify about a murder. But dozens of people were paying Bulger every week, and payment is a crime with a paper trail and a lot of witnesses. So they went after the bookmakers. Bookmakers are not hard men. They are middle-aged people with families who count money for a living, and when a federal prosecutor puts a long sentence in front of them, a certain number of them will describe exactly who they were paying, how much, and where the meetings happened. Investigators arrested them, charged them, and put them in that position one at a time. It took years, and each cooperating witness had to be protected, because everyone involved understood what had happened to people who talked in that city. A major Boston bookmaker came over in the early 1990s, and others followed, and each one described the same weekly amount handed across for permission to operate. By late 1994, the case was written. It charged Bulger, Flemmi, and Francis Salem, who by then was running what was left of the Italian organization in New England, with racketeering built on extortion. There were no murder charges in it, and it did not need any. Extortion alone was enough to put all 3 of them away for a long time. Almost nobody knew the filing date. The FBI's Boston office was deliberately kept at arm's length. But information in a federal building moves, and it moved to John Connolly. On the evening of December 23, 1994, Bulger was told the indictment was coming. He did not panic, and he did not run in the sense of fleeing in the middle of the night with nothing. He had been preparing for this possibility for years. He had identity documents in other names. He had money in several places. He had a car ready. He collected his longtime girlfriend, Teresa Stanley, and they drove out of Boston that night. The indictment was unsealed in early January 1995. State police and DEA agents took Stephen Flemmi outside a restaurant in Quincy, and he had no warning at all, which says a great deal about who the tip had been passed to and who it had not. Salome ran and was caught in Florida later that year. Bulger was gone. There is one more piece of that period that belongs here, because it is on the record, and it is hard to believe. John Morris, the former supervisor who had taken money, was by then working at the FBI Academy in Virginia. He had a conversation with Bulger while Bulger was a fugitive, in which he effectively asked him not to reveal the payments. Bulger's answer was that if he went down, Morris was going down with him. Morris later admitted the whole exchange under a grant of immunity. The truth came out through Stephen Flemy's defense, rather than through the manhunt. Flemy was in custody facing a racketeering case he could not beat, so his lawyers tried something that had never really been tried before. They argued that he could not be prosecuted because he had been an FBI informant for decades and had been promised protection in exchange. To make that argument, they had to put the relationship on the record. The judge who got it was Mark Wolf, and he did not treat it as a nuisance motion. He held hearings that ran for months across 1997 and 1998, and he made the government produce its files and its agents. Retired agents testified. Serving agents testified. John Morris testified under immunity and admitted taking $7,000 and a case of wine with $1,000 inside it, and he broke down on the stand. In September 1999, Wolf issued a ruling that ran to 661 pages. It laid out the entire history. It described how Bulger and Flemy had been recruited, how they had been protected, how they had been pulled out of the race-fixing indictment in 1979, how agents had warned them about investigations and about informants, and how supervisors had known enough to stop it and had not. What Wolf produced was not a summary. It went through the relationship year by year, quoting the government's own files back at it, and it named the specific occasions on which agents had warned Bulger and Flemy about people who were talking to law enforcement. Some of those people were dead by the time the ruling was published, and the ruling laid out the sequence in each case, which is what turned a corruption story into a series of homicide investigations. It was the single most damaging document ever produced about the FBI's informant program, and it was written by a federal judge who had once worked at the Justice Department himself. Everything after that was collapse. Kevin Weeks was indicted in late 1999. He learned in the course of it that the man he had worked beside for 20 years, whom he had protected and lied for, had been informing on people the entire time. He cooperated. He admitted being an accessory to 5 murders, served 5 years, and led investigators to the graves in January 2000. John Martirano made a deal as well, and it produced more anger than any other decision in the case. Martirano admitted taking part in 20 murders, including Roger Wheeler and John Callahan. In exchange for his testimony, he received a sentence of 14 years and served 12. He was released in 2007. He gave interviews afterward. Families of his victims have never accepted it, and every juror and journalist who covered the trial had to reckon with the fact that the government's star witness had killed 20 people and walked out. Flemy held out longer, then pleaded guilty in 2003 and took a life sentence to avoid facing capital charges in Oklahoma and Florida. He has been a cooperating witness ever since. John Connolly was indicted in December 1999. In May 2002, a federal jury in Boston convicted him of racketeering and obstruction of justice for warning Bulger and Flemy about investigations and about informants, and specifically for the tip that let Bulger run. He was sentenced to 10 years. That was not the end of it for him. In 2005, Florida charged him in connection with the murder of John Callahan, on the theory that his warning is what caused the killing. In 2008, a Miami jury convicted him of second-degree murder with a firearm, even though he was more than 1,000 miles away when Martirano pulled the trigger. He was sentenced to 40 years. Francis Salem, the third man named in the 1994 indictment, went a different route again. He fled, was caught in Florida, served his time, learned during the Wolf hearings that Bulger and Flemy had been informing for years while he had not been, and then became a cooperating witness himself and entered the Witness Protection Program. That was not the end of his story either. In 2018, in his 80s, he was convicted of a murder committed in 1993 and sentenced to life, which meant that a man who had already been through all of this went back to prison as an old man for something the government had learned about decades late. The habit of the whole case is that nothing ever fully closed. Cases reopened, convictions were appealed, bodies came up years after they went down, and men who thought they had finished with it were pulled back in. The damage spread outward into places that had nothing to do with the rackets. Billy Bulger, the Senate president, had taken a telephone call from his fugitive brother in January 1995 at their brother John's house. He did not report it. Their brother John was later convicted of perjury and obstruction for lying about contacts with the fugitive. In June 2003, Billy Bulger testified before a committee of the United States House of Representatives under a grant of immunity and said that his first instinct had been to help his brother and that he did not feel an obligation to help anyone catch him. He was by then the president of the University of Massachusetts. The political pressure did not stop, and he resigned that September. The FBI's Boston office spent years being investigated by its own department, by Congress, and by the press. Agents who had done nothing wrong spent their careers explaining it. The public accounting came later, and it was extensive. Beginning in 2001, a committee of the United States House of Representatives spent months examining what had happened in Boston. It took testimony from prosecutors, from retired agents, from Tulsa police, from victims' families, and from Billy Bulger. It produced a report with a title that left nothing to interpretation, describing the FBI's use of murderers as informants as one of the greatest failures of federal law enforcement in American history. And the man at the center of it was not there for any of it. While the hearings ran, while the bodies came out of the ground, while his handler was convicted and his partner pleaded guilty, and his brother lost his career, James Bulger was somewhere else entirely, living under another name, reading newspapers about himself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. He spent the next 16 years as one of the most wanted men on Earth, with $2 million offered for information and his face on television in a dozen countries. He was living about 20 miles from the FBI office in Los Angeles, and the person who finally recognized him was not looking for him at all. Section 9. 16 years. For the first few weeks, he was simply a man on the road, with a woman who did not want to be there. Teresa Stanley had been with Bulger for around 30 years. She had children and grandchildren in Boston, and a life she had no interest in leaving. They drove down the East Coast, spent time in Louisiana and along the Gulf, and by the beginning of 1995, she had made up her mind that she wanted to go home. He took her home. In February 1995, he drove back into the Boston area, which was the boldest thing he did during the entire 16 years, dropped her off, and left again the same day with Catherine Gregg. Gregg was in her 40s, a trained dental hygienist from South Boston, with a twin sister named Margaret. She had known Bulger since the 1970s, and had been involved with him for years, alongside his other relationships. She was quiet, she was careful about her appearance, and she loved animals to a degree that eventually mattered enormously. She left everything and went with him, and she stayed for the next 16 years. The early period involved travel. They moved through several states and spent time outside the country, partly in order to reach money he had put away abroad years before. Then they did the thing that almost no fugitive does, which is stop moving. By the middle of the 1990s, James Bulger and Catherine Gregg were living in a rent-controlled two-bedroom apartment in a building called the Princess Eugenia at 1012 3rd Street in Santa Monica, California, about 2 blocks from the ocean. The rent was a little over $1,000 a month. They paid it in cash, in an envelope, every month for roughly 14 years. They were Charlie and Carol Gasco. The identity came from a man in Santa Monica who sold it to them, which is how they got most of their documents. They bought names from people living on the street who had nothing and needed money, and used them for driver's licenses, medical care, and rent. The life they lived there was extraordinarily ordinary. He was an old man with white hair and a beard, who wore a hat and walked to the pier. She was a tidy woman who kept the apartment spotless and worried about the local cats. They did not have a car. They did not have a telephone in their name. They paid cash for everything and never used a credit card. He read constantly, took an interest in military history and true crime, and watched documentaries about organized crime, including at least one about himself. Neighbors liked them well enough, and found them a little odd. Charlie was polite, occasionally sharp with people, and did not want anyone in the apartment. Carol was friendly, gave things away, and fed a stray cat that lived around the building. When one neighbor was in difficulty, Charlie handed over cash without being asked. Inside the walls of that apartment, there were more than 30 firearms and $822,000 in cash, packed into compartments he had cut into the plaster. He also had a heart condition, and he got treatment for it under a false name at ordinary clinics, which is one of many points where the whole thing could have ended, and did not. He wrote as well. At some point during those years, he began a handwritten account of his own life, an unfinished manuscript that sat in that apartment. Nobody outside the two of them knew it existed, and it is going to matter later. Meanwhile, the search for him became one of the largest and most expensive fugitive investigations in American history. He went on to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list in August 1999. The reward went to $1 million and then to $2 million, which was the largest amount ever offered for a domestic fugitive. Agents were assigned to the case full-time in Boston. Tips came in from all over the world, thousands of them, and every serious one had to be worked. There were reported sightings in Ireland, in England, in Italy, in Mexico, in Canada, in dozens of American states. Task force members traveled abroad repeatedly. When Osama bin Laden was killed in May 2011, Bulger moved to the top of the list. There were near misses in those 16 years, and each one is a reminder of how thin the whole thing was. Early on, he traveled abroad and got into a safe deposit box, holding money he had put away years before. Investigators reconstructed some of that movement afterward, and there was at least one point at which he was close enough to being identified that a slightly different decision by a bank employee or a border officer would have ended it. He came back to the United States after that and stayed. None of it produced him, and the reason is the least dramatic thing in this entire story. The publicity was built around a man who had grown a beard and looked like 10,000 other elderly men, and who had stopped committing crimes altogether. A fugitive with money who takes no risks, contacts nobody from his old life, drives no car, holds no telephone in his own name, and does nothing more interesting than walk to a beach, is close to unfindable, no matter how much money is offered for him. Greg's part in it was total. She had left a home, a profession, a twin sister, and every person she knew, and she spent 16 years in a 2-bedroom apartment with a man who could not go anywhere or meet anyone. She managed the appearances, the shopping, the medical appointments, the small talk with neighbors. When investigators finally built a campaign around her habits, they were building it around the only half of the couple that had a life outside the door. So in 2011, the Bureau changed the target. The new campaign was built entirely around Catherine Gregg. She was 60, she had a distinctive look, she had a background as a dental hygienist, she had a documented history of plastic surgery, she took care of her hair and nails, and she loved animals. Those are habits that put a woman in front of other people regularly. Investigators reasoned that whoever recognized the couple would recognize her first. The public service announcement ran on daytime television in 14 cities on June 20 and 21, 2011, in the sort of time slots aimed at people who visit salons and dentists. The call came in from Iceland. A woman named Anna Bjornsdottir had lived part of the year in Santa Monica. She was a former Miss Iceland who had worked as an actress and a model, and she had known the couple in that neighborhood casually, the way neighbors know the faces on their own block. What connected them was the stray cat. She and Carol had both looked after it. She saw the broadcast at home in Reykjavik and recognized the woman on the screen immediately. On June 22, 2011, agents did not go through the door. They knew there was a heavy chance of weapons inside, and an 81-year-old man who had spent his life expecting exactly this moment. So they had the building manager telephone the apartment and tell Charlie Gasco that his storage locker in the garage had been broken into. He came down to the garage and was arrested there at gunpoint, without a shot being fired. He gave the false name first, then confirmed who he was. Greg was arrested upstairs. She was calm and asked about the cat. 16 years and 6 months after he drove out of Boston. The search ended in a parking garage in a beach town 20 miles from the FBI's Los Angeles headquarters, on a tip about a stray animal. What agents took out of that apartment beyond the guns and the money says as much about the 16 years as anything else. Identification documents in a range of names. Books, a great many of them, mostly about crime, war, and law enforcement. Household items bought carefully and cheaply. Medical paperwork under a false name. And a stack of handwritten pages in which an 80-year-old fugitive was setting down his own account of his life for an audience he had not identified. Agents boxed those pages up with the guns and the cash, and they sat in evidence for more than a decade before becoming the center of a court fight that is still running. He was flown back to Boston within days, brought in under heavy guard, and taken through a set of hearings that drew crowds outside the courthouse. He was 81, in reasonable health and entirely composed, and he pleaded not guilty to a 19-count murder indictment. He told the court he could not afford a lawyer, which prompted an argument about the $822,000 found in his walls, and a taxpayer-funded defense was eventually approved on the basis that the cash had been forfeited to the government and set aside for victims. One thing changed on paper while he was gone, and it is the reason he faced the case he eventually faced. The 1994 charges were about extortion. Once weeks came over and the bodies came out of the ground in 2000, prosecutors went back to a grand jury and returned a far larger indictment, this one charging Bulger with taking part in 19 murders. He had been a fugitive for 5 years by then and knew nothing about it until he was in custody. The man arrested in Santa Monica in 2011 was facing a case that had been built almost entirely after he left. Catherine Gregg pleaded guilty in 2012 to harboring a fugitive and to identity fraud, and was sentenced to 8 years. She was later given an additional 21 months for refusing to testify before a grand jury investigating who else had helped them. She served the full term, finished it in home confinement, and walked out of federal custody in July 2020 at the age of 69. She moved back to South Boston with her twin sister. Families of the victims made their feelings about that sentence clear. Teresa Stanley, who had gone home in 1995, died in 2012 without ever having testified about any of it. What remained was a trial that Boston had been waiting for since 1994, and a defendant who had made it clear from the first week that he was not interested in defending himself against the murders. He was interested in one thing, and it was not his freedom. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. He sat in a federal courtroom for 2 months, while the people who had worked for him described the killings one by one. He never denied a single one of them to the jury. The only accusation he fought was the one about what he had been doing for the FBI, and 30 years later, his own handwriting is still being argued over in a courthouse in Miami. Section 10. The Verdict, Hazleton, and the Departed. The trial opened on June 12, 2013, at the federal courthouse on the South Boston waterfront, a building that sits a few hundred yards from the parking lot where Brian Halloran and Michael Donahue were shot in 1982. Judge Denise Casper presided. Fred Wyshak, who had started building the case in 1990, was at the prosecution table. Bulger was 83. His defense was run by 2 Boston lawyers, J.W. Carney and Hank Brennan, and it was not a defense in the normal sense, because Bulger had told them what he wanted, and it was not acquittal. He wanted 2 things. He wanted it established that he had never been an informant, and he wanted to argue that a federal prosecutor named Jeremiah O'Sullivan had given him blanket immunity years earlier, covering everything up to and including murder. Judge Casper ruled that the immunity claim could not go to the jury. No prosecutor has the authority to license future murders. O'Sullivan had died in 2009 and could not be asked about it, and there was no document. Bulger's response was that the whole proceeding was a sham, and from that point forward he barely engaged with it. Over 35 days, the government called 72 witnesses. The 3 men who had been closest to him testified in turn. John Martirano described the shootings he had carried out, including Roger Wheeler in Tulsa and John Callahan in Florida, in the flat voice of a man who had already made his deal and served his time. Kevin Weeks described the graves, the guns, the extortions, and the murders he had watched. He and Bulger insulted each other openly in the courtroom, which was the only moment in the trial where the defendant looked fully alive. Stephen Flemmi, serving life, described the killings of Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey and pinned both of them on Bulger, and Bulger's lawyers spent hours trying to establish that Flemmi had done it himself. John Morris, the former FBI supervisor who had taken the money and the wine, testified as well. He turned to the Donahue family in the gallery and apologized to them from the witness stand. Bulger did not testify. When Judge Casper asked him directly whether the choice was his own, he said it was, and said he was making it because he had been denied the chance to make the argument he wanted to make. He never once told the jury he had not committed the murders. The jury of 8 men and 4 women deliberated for 32.5 hours across 5 days. On August 12, 2013, they convicted him on 31 of 32 counts, including racketeering, extortion, money laundering, drug dealing, and machine gun possession. The single acquittal was on one extortion charge. On the murders, they went through all 19 one at a time. They found it proved that he took part in the killings of Paul McGonigal, Eddie Connors, Tommy King, Richard Castucci, Roger Wheeler, Brian Halloran, Michael Donahue, John Callahan, Arthur Barrett, John McIntyre, and Deborah Hussey. 11 people. They found the government had not proved his role in 7 others, most of them from the gang wars of the early 1970s, where the witnesses were dead and the evidence was thin. On Deborah Davis, they returned no finding at all. The reaction in the courtroom split the families down the middle. Patricia Donahue cried. Relatives of victims who did not get a verdict walked out furious, including the daughter of Buddy Leonard and the son of William O'Brien, who said prosecutors had barely mentioned his father. One juror later said the panel had given Bulger the benefit of the doubt on some killings, and that he personally believed Bulger had killed Deborah Davis. Another juror, Janet Ular, said afterward that she was ashamed to have sat on the case, because the trial had been built on the testimony of admitted killers who had been given extraordinary deals, and she later exchanged letters with Bulger in prison. On November 14, 2013, Judge Casper sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years and ordered restitution to the families. Victims' relatives spoke first. He kept his back to them and did not turn around, and Casper noted for the record that the choice not to look at them was his own. The trial itself was an event in Boston in a way that is hard to convey. People lined up before dawn for seats. Families of the dead sat in the same rows every day for 2 months, some of them for people whose deaths the jury would ultimately decide were not proved. Reporters who had covered the case since the 1980s were in the gallery, including the 2 Globe journalists, whose book had first laid the relationship out in detail. What the families were watching was not a mystery being solved. Almost nothing that came out of that courtroom was new by 2013. Judge Wolf had put the essential facts on the record in 1999. The bodies had come up in 2000, and Connolly had been convicted twice. The trial was the last available forum, and for a lot of the people in that gallery, it was the only time anyone in an official position was going to say their relative's name out loud. The sentencing hearing took 2 days, and most of it belonged to other people. Relatives of the dead came up one at a time and spoke about fathers, brothers, sisters, and sons, and several of them spoke for victims the jury had not convicted him of killing, which the judge permitted over the objection of the defense. Some of them had waited close to 40 years for the chance. One after another, they addressed a man who would not turn his head. He was sent first to a penitentiary in Arizona and then to Coleman in Florida. He wrote letters constantly, mostly to people who wrote to him first, including students, and a juror, and various researchers. He was in a wheelchair by then and had a heart condition. In October 2018, the Bureau of Prisons moved him. He had been in trouble at Coleman over threats to a staff member, his medical status had been reclassified, and the decision was made to transfer him to United States Penitentiary Hazleton in West Virginia. Hazleton was a high-security prison where staff had been publicly warning about understaffing and violence, and where 2 men had already been killed that year. He was 89, and he was known everywhere in the federal system as a man who had informed on the mafia. He arrived on the evening of October 29, 2018, and was placed in general population. Hazleton had a reputation inside the federal system that had nothing to do with Bulger. Staff unions had been going public for months about understaffing, mandatory overtime, and officers being pulled off posts to cover kitchens and medical units. 2 inmates had already been killed there in 2018. Sending an 89-year-old man in a wheelchair into the general population of that prison, when the entire federal system knew he had informed on the New England Mafia, and when other prisoners from Massachusetts were housed in the same unit, is the decision every review of his death has come back to. Word that he was coming had already reached the unit. On the morning of October 30, 2 inmates entered his cell and spent about 7 minutes there. A guard found his body at 8:21 that morning. He had been beaten to death, and his body had been arranged in the bed to look as though he was asleep. He had been in the prison less than 12 hours. In August 2022, a federal grand jury in West Virginia charged 3 men. Fotios Gias, a former mafia enforcer from Springfield, Massachusetts, already serving life for 2 murders. Paul DeCollegiero, from Lowell, and Sean McKinnon, In 2022, the Justice Department's Inspector General published its findings on how that had been allowed to happen. The report described multiple layers of management failure, widespread incompetence, and flawed policies inside the Bureau of Prisons. It found no evidence that anyone had acted with malicious intent, and it made clear that a series of ordinary institutional failures had put the most recognizable informant in the federal system into the general population of a violent penitentiary alongside organized crime figures from New England. The case took another 2 years. In June 2024, prosecutors dropped the claim that McKinnon had taken part in the killing, and he pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI and was sentenced to time already served. In August 2024, DeCollegiero was sentenced to more than 4 years for assault, with prosecutors saying he had acted as the lookout. On September 6, 2024, Gies pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years, 15 for voluntary manslaughter, and 10 for assault, to run one after the other, and on top of the life sentence he was already serving. The murder and conspiracy charges were dismissed as part of the agreement. The Justice Department had already announced it would not seek the death penalty. Bulger's own family sued the Bureau of Prisons over the transfer. A federal judge in West Virginia dismissed the case in 2022, ruling that the law shields the decision about where to house an inmate. The rest of the wreckage is still moving. John Connolly was granted medical release from a Florida prison in February 2021 after doctors said he had terminal cancer and about a year to live. He went home to Massachusetts. He is still alive, in his mid-80s, and still fighting the conviction. In March 2026, his lawyers filed a motion in Miami to throw it out, and the evidence they are relying on is the unfinished manuscript the FBI took out of the Santa Monica apartment in 2011. According to the filing, Bulger wrote that Connolly had not leaked the information that led to John Callahan's murder, named John Morris as the real source, and described Connolly as a sacrificial lamb. The defense says the material was never turned over to them, and that it surfaced only after a longtime prosecutor on the case resigned amid reports of misconduct. In July 2026, Florida prosecutors urged the judge to reject all of it, arguing that Bulger took back those claims once he learned, while preparing for his own trial, that Connolly had documented him extensively as an informant, and that after that he had no interest in clearing him. Nearly 8 years after Bulger was beaten to death in a cell in West Virginia, his handwriting is still the main evidence in an open case. The other people from this story ended up in different places. Stephen Flemmi is still in federal prison serving life, and has spent more than 20 years as a cooperating witness. Kevin Weeks served 5 years, came home to Boston, wrote a book about it, and has lived openly in the city ever since, which says something about how much the neighborhood's old rules were worth in the end. John Martirano, who admitted 20 murders, has been a free man since 2007 and has given television interviews. Billy Bulger left the University of Massachusetts in 2003 and has lived quietly since, and the two brothers never saw each other again after 1995. The families got little. The McIntyre family collected a judgment. The Donahue and Halloran families won one and had it taken away on a filing deadline. Others got nothing at all, because there was no statute that reached what had been done to them and no defendant left with money. Then there is the movie. In 2006, Martin Scorsese released The Departed, about a Boston crime boss with a mole inside the state police and a police informant inside his own crew. The crime boss, played by Jack Nicholson, was openly modeled on Bulger, including his relationship with the FBI. The film won Best Picture at the Academy Awards in 2007 and remains the most widely seen version of this story by an enormous margin. In 2015, Johnny Depp played him directly in Black Mass, based on the book written by the two Boston Globe reporters who had spent years digging out what the FBI had done. Both films tell the same story in the same shape, which is a criminal and an agent locked together while a city goes on around them. What neither has room for is the ordinary machinery underneath it. The reports filed and never checked, the prosecutor who took 2 names off a list, the bookmakers who paid every week for 20 years, the parents in a housing project burying teenagers, the families who spent decades being told there was nothing to find. What the films leave out is the part that actually changed anything. In January 2001, the Attorney General issued new national guidelines on the use of confidential informants, tightening how they are approved, reviewed, and supervised, and requiring far more oversight when a source is committing crimes. Those rules exist because of Boston. The arithmetic at the end of it is not complicated. The FBI got the Angulo family, and that was a real achievement. In exchange, it protected two men for roughly 15 years. And during those 15 years, those men killed a businessman in Tulsa, an accountant in Florida, a truck driver on the Boston waterfront, a fisherman from Quincy, a safecracker, two young women, and a string of people in South Boston whose families were told for decades that nobody knew what had happened. James Bulger was 89 when he died on the floor of a prison cell in West Virginia, in a system that had never once put him there while he was useful. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.